Okay, I think we got our copies made, and some of you maybe are talking about questions, but it seems like conversations went in a lot of different directions today. I think, where did we leave off in this group? 1 Samuel 24. Okay. One of the things that happens in this section is it starts talking about this wilderness of Maon and a Carmel. And if you look up Carmel, or you'll find it in other places, like in the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal, that's talking about a Carmel, Mount Carmel, that's in the north of the land of Israel. It's over along the Mediterranean. It's near the modern-day city of Haifa and Acre. So it's not the Maon and the Carmel that this is talking about are down south in Israel near the city of Hebron. Hebron is where Abraham was buried. Hebron is where he seemed to have lived. Today, it is I think it's in the West Bank, and I think it's a Palestinian area. But if you're trying to figure out where David is on the map, these are the highlands and the hills south of Jerusalem. It's not the same Mount Carmel in other places in the Bible. And there is this story of a cave that is repeated. In this case, like the first cave, David seems to hide in alone. This time, Saul comes to the cave, and this is at En-Gedi. Saul is still chasing down David, and you have this contrast between David, who is patiently waiting on the Lord and waiting for the Lord to act, and Saul, who is consistently trying to kill him, even after he's sworn not to. We've talked about that contrast before, and it really is just this kind of stunning irony, this reversal of fortunes, that Saul, who is the king and has all the power, is afraid of David, who is this kind of outcast from society who can't even show his face in a lot of cases. But Saul acts kind of paranoid about him. So Saul goes into this cave to relieve himself. This is the familiar idea. David rejects the idea of killing Saul. His men say, "The Lord has delivered him into your hands." And David rejects the idea of actually attacking Saul, so he cuts off part of his cloak. It seems like Saul must have fallen asleep. This is a kind of deep sleep that the Lord gives. It shows up in the life of Abraham when there's the strange covenant where he cuts in half those animals and he falls asleep, and this burning torch passes through the middle of them. Then Saul flees the cave. David comes out after him and tells him about his cloak. David asks why Saul is chasing him to end his life. David proclaims his innocence. He's not raising his hand to attack Saul. David accounts the promises of the Lord as worthy of support, as worthy of praise, as worthy of following. And Saul doesn't seem to act in the same way. Even Saul recognizes at this point how righteous David is. That David has been proved innocent, David has been proved right. And it's kind of odd because he actually ends up giving David peace for a while. He finally follows through with his word, at least for a little while. He makes David swear an oath to protect his house. This is going to play into the story later. What it means is Saul doesn't want David to attack the ones in his family who remain. If you remember, there's already been some trouble with Michal, who was given to David as a wife, and then Saul takes her and gives her to another man because he's mad at David. And there's Jonathan, there's Saul himself, and oftentimes at this point in history, when a new king takes over, if he's not part of the same family and the same dynasty, like the same tribe or the same clan, all of the remaining ones from the old dynasty are killed. Like everyone, so that there can't be an adversary who can claim the throne. It's important to remember that history is actually really bloody and sad. There's a lot of really broken things in the world. I mean, even in our country, if you think of it, that there is this idea of the peaceful transfer of power from one group of leadership to the next, that it's not dynastic, is relatively new in history. Like, that isn't all that old. The 17 and 1800s are where a lot of those ideas began, or a lot of those ideas really took root. When you look at history, it's much more like this, like a new family takes the throne, and so the entire old family is murdered. This happened in the Soviet Union, if you remember, in 1917, with the establishment of the Russian state under Vladimir Lenin. They kill all of the Romanov family. I think a few of them escaped on one of the trains or something, but it was that same kind of idea. They don't want a rival to the throne. This kind of pride, wanting to be in the center place, wanting to be secure, is something that is part of the entire human experience. It's not all that stable. It doesn't work all that well, because you probably know in your life and have discovered that security really can't come from the things of this world. None of it is all that lasting. It looks like it at some points, but it doesn't. That ultimately you have to find security in the Lord. You have to find a kind of peace within yourself and in entrusting yourself to God, because there's no way to prepare for the future completely. There's nothing that accounts for all of the challenges that you'll face, that will show up in your life, in your family, in things like the death of a spouse, like all of that sort of shakes our sense of meaning, shakes our sense of purpose, shakes how we thought life was going to go. And so there are places and times too where I think trying to take the scriptures and learn the lessons from them, not just to ask what is happening, but what is it trying to teach us? I mean, in the life of Saul, you see a lot of jealousy, you see a lot of pride, stubbornness, you see a lot of foolishness. And in a way, I think we can see how sticky it is, how easy it is for Saul to get caught up in those things. I don't think he wants that at first, but he definitely gets stuck in what he is doing. And he gets very caught up in it. And it ends up making his life into a mess. He's haunted by jealousy. He can't just be himself and be king and be happy. He has to try and take out David. So then 1 Samuel 25, chapter 25, sort of interjects this little note, and Samuel dies. And then it moves on to the story of Nabal. It's a little bit strange, because Samuel was this great figure in the history of Israel. Samuel was the last of the judges and marks this transition point between judges and kings. Samuel was this great priest who was after the heart of the Lord, hearing his voice. And he dies. And it's a little bit striking that there's not much said about it. It doesn't say that Saul went to bury him. It doesn't say that David went to bury him, although maybe he did. Maybe he couldn't because Saul might be looking for David, suspecting that he would show up at the death of Samuel. And then it talks about the situation with Nabal. Things must still be fairly desperate for David because he goes and he's kind of calling in a favor. He and his men took care of some of Nabal's men when they were out with them in the wilderness. And now David is sending messengers to remind Nabal that this happened. And so it's sort of like, you owe me. And this is an honor culture. This is a culture where this isn't just a nice thing for Nabal to do. We would say this is a kind of social obligation. He's obligated here. He's responsible to help David and his men. Nabal, his name means fool. And so how do you expect he's going to behave? Foolishly. So he's ill-natured and rather grouchy about it. And his question is, who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? And it echoes a question that's earlier in the scriptures. Anyone know who it echoes? There's something before this. Someone asks, who is the Lord that I should heed him? Pharaoh. Exactly. In the time of Exodus, the same question, like, who is God? Why should I care? Who are you? What do you mean to me? That's the same sort of thing that it's asking. It's kind of strange because David is so famous. David, who has been leading the army, David, who has attacked the Philistines, David, who has been kind of the savior of the nation. And it's like, well, who is David? And one could say he's maybe at this point becoming the most important man in the country. And it's maybe foolish, it's maybe short-sighted, it's maybe like, well, what is he to me? Maybe he knows who David is, but he doesn't want to say. So David becomes angry and rises to go and kill Nabal. He swears an angry oath. This offends David's sense of propriety, or it offends him. Somehow he gets caught up in a very emotional outburst here. And it's not really helpful. He takes this as a personal offense, as something against himself. And so he decides that he's going to gather his men and he's going to go and kill Nabal and probably take the food anyway. He swears to destroy his house. Now, again, what is interesting about the story is this imitates another character. Who does this imitate? It actually just happened earlier in these chapters. Saul. Saul, who decides to kill the priests at Nob. And so here you have this kind of irony again, because David is this character who has been faithful to the Lord and doesn't want to lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. And now it's like the straw that broke the camel's back, and now David's angry, but he ends up doing the same thing that Saul does. And so it's sort of like that trouble on the horizon kind of theme. Like, if Saul is a bad guy, you don't really want to be like Saul. You want to be more like David was in the story. So David behaves rashly. He, I think, is desperate. I mean, to me, that seems to be part of how you make sense out of this story is that David isn't just his normal self, that David is desperate. He feels a lot of pressure. He is trying to take care of his men. Maybe they're starving. Maybe they really need food. Something is pushing him. Still not a reason to swear to kill someone. That's not good. But David seems to be oppressed by his needs. So the servants realize that this is bad, and they go and they talk to Abigail, who is the wife of Nabal. And she realizes that this is her husband being foolish, this is her husband making a big mistake, and it's not going to play out all that well. And so she gathers a whole pile of food and loads up some mules or loads up some donkeys and brings it out to David and his men. And it's interesting because it's a very significant quantity of food. And, if Nabal had that much extra, or if he had this much prepared, why wouldn't you give it to David? Currying favor with the future king, currying favor with the leader of the army usually goes well for you. But he doesn't. Abigail does. And then she does something that is very unique in the scriptures, and I think highlights her goodness in a way that hasn't happened very often before. What does she do? She bows down before him, but people have done that. There's something more. She acknowledges the Lord. That's true, but other people have done that. She blames herself. She didn't commit the sin, but she accepts responsibility for it. Now that would be much more in imitation or being like Jesus, who's the innocent lamb who doesn't deserve anything that he receives, but he steps up and takes responsibility or accepts the punishment, the penalty of sin that is laid on his shoulders. So Abigail takes responsibility herself, even though she has nothing to do with it. She offers herself as the victim. This is a sacrifice on behalf of another. This is a deed of great righteousness. This is a deed of great holiness. She does acknowledge the Lord and the problem of blood guilt, and she prays for David to God. She commends David into the hands of the Lord. She shows herself to be extremely righteous in the story. And again, it's very ironic because in this case, David isn't. In this case, David has promised to kill this man and his entire family, and probably including his wife. Like, according to David's promise, he should pull out his sword and kill Abigail. And she's here accepting responsibility for a sin that she didn't commit. She is living in the truth of love. And David recognizes that the Lord has a hand in this. That this is sort of God throwing a roadblock in his way. This is an obstacle to his plan. And he's thankful because he recognizes the destructiveness of his oath. He realizes that his oath was wicked. To wipe out a man's family because he slighted you is going too far. He was determined to kill Nabal. He had taken evil into his heart. It was growing and it was germinating. I think this is one of the things, I made a new word, ruminating. Well, that's a very nice word. I wonder what it means. When you allow evil to sit in your heart and grow and give it room, it does. I think this is one of the reasons why Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount talks about our hearts so much and chasing out anger or praying for those who strike us, like offering the other cheek. Because inside of our heart, unforgiveness, resentment, anger, these feelings can grow if they are given room. And they do grow and they spread. They're a bit like an infection. And I wish it didn't work this way. I wish that we weren't quite like this, but it just seems like this is true. Humanity after the fall we experience this kind of brokenness, that things that sit in our heart tend not to sit where we put them. They tend to grow and expand. Fears are like that as well. And it seems like one of the ways through them, maybe the only way through them, is to confront it, to expose these places in your heart. Some of it is to expose it to the Lord's mercy, to ask for forgiveness, to ask God to begin to change your heart so that you don't feel that way, or so you're not so caught up in emotion. But it's really impressive that David experiences this moment as a moment of grace, that this was a chance to turn away from his path. And I think David would have sinned greatly he did sin greatly, but it would have been even graver had he carried through with his plan. Remember that David at the end of his life doesn't get to build the temple because he has too much blood on his hands. David is a man after the Lord's own heart, but he does seem like he gets to be a bit of a hothead. And he has people killed when it's unnecessary, when it's not in war, when they're innocent. So the story doesn't end there. Nabal throws a feast and gets drunk. His wife tells him in the morning about bringing the food out to David, and probably about this whole moment, like, I saved your life, you now owe me. And it says like his heart fails him and he dies. There is a physical syndrome that can happen. It's not super common, but there's a particular kind of thing called like broken heart syndrome, and it can show up in some of the medical tests and the imaging that we have now. But there are times where that actually happens. It's like someone is so sad and so lost that their heart stops working right. Maybe that's what happened to him. In a way, it's a little bit like in the story, the man gets his just desserts. He didn't want to throw a feast for David, and he is selfish about it, and now that thing that he thought he had, if he was saving the food for himself, or if he wanted to, stay in his position or whatever it was, like that comes to an end. If you put grain in bigger grain houses, if you build bigger and bigger storehouses, Jesus talks about that. Like, you can store up grain forever, but you fool. Like, today or tonight, your life will be demanded of you, and what will it count for? This is where Jesus talks about storing up treasure in heaven. One could say that Nabal was not storing up treasure in heaven. He was thinking about things of this world. And it comes up short. It passes away like straw. It doesn't last. And then it notes that David makes Abigail his wife. Now, this feels a little bit like a bell ringing at a church and echoing, across the horizon, or like a storm is coming. Off a long way, you hear this kind of dinging, and it's like, uh-oh. In this case, is it a good thing or a bad thing? You seem puzzled. It's why mostly bad? She has a lot of problems. Maybe. At least Abigail, I don't think it talks very much about.
David had a problem with women.
David had a problem with women. Yes, David does have this problem, but at least in this case, it's like we know that this is an echo of things to come, or this is sort of pointing the way, this is drawing a line between what is happening now and what is happening in the future. But at least in this case, the action doesn't seem quite as bad. In this case, Abigail is free to marry because her husband is now dead. And one might even be able to say about David that he is free to marry because so far I think it's only talked about Michal, but it notes in this chapter that Saul had taken her away from David and given her to another man. You know, marriage was often political at this time, and it's a little bit hard because even by the end of this section, David, it's going to mention that he has another wife, Ahinoam. But marriage was often political. Like Saul wanted to endear himself to David, so he joins his house to David's. He joins his dynasty to David by offering his daughter in marriage. Now, in some cases, not all of them, those relationships were purely political. Like it was a marriage on paper that didn't have a lot of real effects in the lives of the people. On the other hand, that's not to say that they never did. I mean, humanity being what it is, and David and his problems with women would suggest that he had very few of these that were platonic or friendship-like, and many more that were romances, and not the good kind of romances, you know, seduction or something. But at least at this point, David he's not behaving in such a bad way. He may not have another woman around at this moment, but it does definitely, it's like the evil cloud or the, you know, breath of wind that comes that's cold, and all of a sudden you know that more cold is coming. David is attracted to her. Abigail was beautiful, and he decides that he wanted her to be his wife. This again, you can see in the life of David. This is another case where sin grows and it becomes repeated. It doesn't stay contained. You see this in the lives of a lot of the people that commit crimes in our own day. You know, people that do something like a mass shooting, that's never the first sin. That's never the first thing that they do. It's usually after a long process where evil has been growing in their heart. Sometimes it involves other things. Serial killers are this way. You know, it doesn't start with killing people in a particular way like serial killers do. It is something that starts often long before that. Sometimes through no fault of their own. I mean, sometimes the initial sort of launching off point of people that end up doing very bad things is that something happened to them. They were beaten by their father or their mother, they were neglected, or they were abused in any number of cases. It's not to say that they're not responsible, but it's just an example for us. I think this should be kind of chilling because David arguably is this man who's been after the heart of God. I mean, he's writing Psalms, he's writing Scripture. He's a man of tremendous holiness in some ways. And yet you can see that he's still frail, that he still falls very easily, that temptation and wickedness is not far away. Sin has this habit of moving from where it starts in intentions and in desires or in fantasies into reality, and it grows. So David makes Abigail his wife, and then again it just sort of casually throws in, and he has another wife, Ahinoam, from Jezreel. Now Jezreel, again, I feel like this is an echo of future things. I didn't get a chance to look it up. Maybe I'll do it quickly. There is a woman who is not thought of very well in the Bible. She is the wife of a king in the north. Let's see, Jeroboam the first, 1225. Oh, rats. I was hoping to find the wife of this guy. Anyway, so Jeroboam the first, he's the king of the north. He has a wife named Jezebel. And Jezebel is not a good person. Jezebel is wicked and evil and scheming and murderous and ambitious and will stop at very little. Very little will stand in her way in order to accomplish what she wants to do. And I think, again, she's a very chilling example for us. She's a significant counterexample of what the problem can be. And I believe she's from Jezreel as well. And so, again, there's this sort of scriptural echo that something is going wrong. It's another one of those sirens far off. And you don't know what the problem is yet, but lots of these details in the scriptures, lots of the things that it just sort of says, it seems like especially when it just throws them in there offhand, those are never insignificant. They have a habit of showing up again and again and again and again. So Ahinoam is another wife for David. And so at least at this point it notes that he has two. Later he acquires more. And it turns out that this constant back and forth and this constant mess with women ends up being a significant snare for David. It ends up being part of his downfall. I think that this speaks to one of the major problems in the modern world is that of lust and seeking pleasure. We live in a world where this is very present, and I would say that if you don't struggle with it yourself, you know people that do, whether they talk about it or not, because it is very, very widespread in our country today. It's very, very active. It's not, I don't know what to think about like people that have immoral relationships or illicit relationships, people that commit adultery. Is it more common now than it was in the past? There's part of us that wants to say yes, but when you look at the pages of history and you read stories, they're full of things where it's like there were